You know, usually when we talk about a scientific process or like a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right.
You think of it kind of like engineering. Like you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the glowing screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
Yeah, it's binary. It is clean. It's either broken or it's not broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's comforting. We fundamentally like things to be visible, to be perfectly categorized, to fit into a neat little box with a label on it.
And then you step out of the hospital or, out of the sterile laboratory and you walk into the world of modern wildlife biology, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely broken.
Right.
You are looking at a scientific landscape that is murky, it's messy, it's covered in mud, and it rarely plays by the rigid rules we have written for it. I mean, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
And today, we are wading right into the deep end of that swamp. Welcome to this custom deep dive where we are exploring the wild, completely unconventional, and highly disruptive frontiers of modern wildlife conservation.
Yeah, based on the actual field stories and expeditions of wildlife biologist Forrest Galante.
Exactly. Our mission today is to look at what it really takes to find species the entire scientific establishment just gave up on. We're going to explore the high-stakes, sci-fi reality of genetic cloning and de-extinction. And, we're going to ask a really uncomfortable question.
Which is whether breaking the rigid established rules of traditional science is actually the only way we are going to save this planet's ecosystems.
It's a massive scope. I mean, we are moving from the absolute raw survival of the African bush to the concrete landscape of Oakland, California, all the way to these pristine boardrooms where billionaires are literally funding the resurrection of the woolly mammoth.
Yeah, and my goal here is to help you, the listener, connect these extreme adrenaline-fueled field stories to the underlying mechanics of our world. Because beneath the stories of wrestling crocodiles and, darting elephants from helicopters, there's a profound commentary on human nature.
Oh, for sure.
It's about our suppressed biological instincts and the actual mechanical future of our biosphere.
So to understand how someone successfully challenges the established scientific order, how a biologist just goes out and finds animals that textbook science insists are gone forever, we have to start with an origin story defined by absolute disruption.
Right, because you don't build an unorthodox approach to science in a sterile classroom. You build it through raw, unfiltered exposure to the food chain.
Yeah, exactly. You build it through lived experience in an environment where the consequences of missing a detail aren't like a failing grade on a test, but actual physical harm.
And that is exactly what growing up in the untamed bush of Zimbabwe looks like.
Right, so picture this. We're talking about a childhood in the 1990s, living on a farm about 45 minutes outside of the capital, Harare. But this wasn't just a quiet agricultural outpost.
No, the family ran safari businesses.
Yeah, so when you aren't doing farm chores, you were out in the Zambezi Valley, you were swimming in rivers where you have to actively dodge crocodiles.
Which is terrifying.
Super terrifying. And you're fishing for tigerfish, which, if you have never seen one, imagine a silver torpedo with a mouthful of interlocking, razor-sharp piranha teeth designed to shear flesh.
Yeah, they are aggressive predators.
And you're having run-ins with wild leopards right on the edge of your property.
See, that creates a foundation built entirely on interacting with nature in its rawest, most unforgiving form. When you grew up in that environment, you aren't learning about the food chain from a diagram on a chalkboard.
No, you're an active participant in it.
Precisely. You are watching the big five, lions, leopards, rhinos, elephants, and Cape buffalo navigate their ecosystem, and you literally have to learn how to navigate it alongside them just to stay safe. It wires the brain differently.
There's this one story from the source material that perfectly captures that rewiring.
Yeah.
Just picture the scene. You are standing in a narrow dirt ravine, essentially a little pathway cut deeply into the earthen bank leading down to the Zambezi River.
It's a geographic bottleneck.
Exactly. It's the only way in or out. And suddenly, a massive, wild bull elephant just wanders down the ravine right behind you.
Completely blocking the exit, you are trapped with a 5-ton animal.
A completely wild animal that could crush you without a second thought. And the grandfather, who is there in the ravine, just calmly says, "Don't move."
And they just stand there, perfectly still.
Yeah, the elephant walks right past them, drinks from the river, pauses, looks at them, and then turns around and walks away up the path. I mean, it is two different species, just sharing space, occupying the exact same niche for a moment with total mutual respect.
The underlying biology of a moment like that is fascinating because what that instills in a person is a baseline biological awareness that simply cannot be replicated in a university lecture hall.
Right.
You learn the mechanics of the wild. You learn the silent way an elephant moves because despite their massive weight, they step on these highly specialized, thick, fatty pads on the soles of their feet.
Wait, fatty pads?
Yeah, they expand and contract, allowing them to walk almost completely silently through dry brush. You learn to read the environment using your senses, not a spreadsheet.
Oh, wow.
You're constantly processing microsignals like the sudden silence of birds, the specific scent of a predator, a shift in the wind. You become a highly tuned instrument for that specific environment. But then in the early 2000s, that entire reality just shatters.
Right.
During the Robert Mugabe regime's land reform campaign in Zimbabwe, the political and social structure of the country essentially collapsed. And just looking strictly at the historical facts of what happened on the ground, it was violently disruptive.
Armed 14-year-old so-called war veterans were physically seizing farms. There were literal shootouts at the farm gates. The family receives a life-or-death ultimatum, and they are forced to flee the country overnight as refugees.
Leaving their entire life behind with only $400 to their name.
Right. It is a total systemic collapse. The economy was destroyed, the currency experienced hyperinflation to the point of being worthless, and suddenly, you are entirely displaced from the only biome you have ever known.
And where do they end up?
This is the crazy part. From the wild, open African savanna, surrounded by the big five to welfare housing in Oakland, California, the mother ends up sick in the hospital sleeping on the floor. It is a massive, jarring culture shock.
It's two entirely different worlds.
To highlight the sheer absurdity of the transition, there is a story of this kid putting on traditional African safari gear, like little khaki shorts, boots, and he runs down to a city park pond in Oakland. Yeah. He wades in nipples deep into this murky city water to try and catch California newts, while people are walking by on the paved path in North Face jackets, drinking coffee, just staring in total confusion.
It is a profound juxtaposition. You have behaviors that are perfectly adapted for one environment being executed in an environment where they make absolutely no sense to the local population.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's literally like taking a highly specialized apex predator from the savanna and dropping it into a completely alien biome, like teleporting a lion into a neon-lit concrete city.
That's a great analogy.
On paper, that level of trauma, dislocation, and culture shock should derail a person. It should break them. So how does a massive shock to the system like that actually create a more effective wildlife scientist?
Well, if we look at this through the lens of evolutionary biology and adaptability, it actually makes perfect sense. In biology, when a species faces extreme environmental disruption, one of two things happens. They either fail to adapt and face local extinction, or they adapt rapidly and become incredibly resilient. This kind of shock to the system forces a profound behavioral plasticity.
Meaning you either learn the new rules immediately or you don't survive.
Precisely. When you are thrust into a survival situation, whether it's managing a farm under threat of armed violence at age 13, or suddenly navigating the tough urban streets of Oakland where your foreign accent and khaki shorts make you a target for fistfights, you develop a heavier reliance on raw human instinct.
You learn to read the concrete jungle the exact same way you learn to read the bush?
Exactly. You are assessing threats, identifying the local hierarchy, and figuring out how to navigate safely. It hardwires a person to observe, react, and trust their gut above all else.
But here's the friction. When you take that highly developed, street-level survival instinct and you try to force it into a standard, rigid American academic environment, it's going to chafe. Badly.
It is a completely incompatible operating system.
Which brings us to how this unorthodox foundation clashes with traditional science. The U.S. school system was a total mismatch. Because in Zimbabwe, the educational system was brutally strict, a remnant of a very different era. If you didn't do your homework or you acted out, you got physically beaten with a cane.
Right. It was a highly punitive system based on immediate, severe physical consequences.
Yeah. So you bring a kid who just escaped a literal war zone to a California high school, and he realizes that if you skip class or don't turn in a paper, the absolute worst thing the administration will do is send you home.
Which is not a punishment to someone with his background.
No. To this kid, that sounds like a vacation.
Yeah.
There was no physical threat. So the grades absolutely plummet. The high school counselor looks at the transcripts and literally says, you are never going to get into a four-year university. It's mathematically impossible.
Which is the standard institutional response.
Yeah.
The system is designed to process conformity, and it flags non-conformity as a failure.
But the breakthrough doesn't happen by suddenly conforming, sitting down, and getting straight A's in standardized math. It happens through a complete hack of the system.
The UC Santa Barbara story.
Yes. During a college tour at UC Santa Barbara, he gets bored with the standard campus walk-around, sneaks away from the tour group, and wanders into a random science building.
As one does.
Right. And he spots a massive terrarium full of stick insects through a laboratory window. He just opens the door, walks right into the professor's office, and starts passionately identifying these bugs.
And not just basic identification.
No, he's telling this burly entomology professor, hey, you really shouldn't mix the Asian species of these phasmids with the African ones. The Asian ones are much more aggressive and they will outcompete them. Just rattling off deep hands-on practical knowledge.
And that is the triumph of experiential knowledge over standardized metrics. Stick insects, or phasmids, have incredibly complex territorial and camouflage behaviors. Knowing how different regional species interact isn't something you typically learn in high school biology. It's something you learn by obsessively observing them in the wild or in complex captive setups. That professor recognized something in that moment that a standardized multiple-choice test cannot measure.
Genuine, obsessive scientific curiosity.
Exactly. And deep field expertise.
And that one conversation, just geeking out over bugs, is what bypassed the failing high school grades. That professor personally sponsored his acceptance into an experimental, honors-level academic program, albeit on strict academic probation.
It's an incredible circumvention of the rules.
It really is. But even once inside the gates of academia, the friction doesn't stop. He's taking upper-level herpetology classes as a freshman and absolutely dominating because he has a total obsession with reptiles.
But failing the basics.
Right. Simultaneously, he is failing basic biology 101.
Sure.
Why? Because studying the microscopic mechanics of mitochondrial DNA in a sterile, windowless lab is profoundly boring to someone whose entire brain is wired to be out in the dirt, holding the actual animal.
This highlights a massive structural issue within the modern biological sciences. We have built an educational pipeline that heavily prizes the rote memorization of microscopic processes and statistical analysis over macroscopic, whole environment understanding.
Like, we train biologists to be lab technicians, not naturalists.
So they do.
And that structural issue becomes glaringly obvious when you look at the reality of entry-level field biology. The dream that they sell you is that you graduate with your degree, you put on a cool hat, and you instantly go out into the rainforest to save jaguars and protect the planet.
But the reality is very different.
So different. You take a grueling job as a biological technician doing data entry. The work on the rugged California Channel Islands is a perfect example from the source material.
The ant counting.
The ant counting. We are talking about spending weeks isolated on these islands in 100-degree heat, wearing a full, stifling hazmat suit, carrying a heavy backpack sprayer full of toxic pesticide to kill invasive weeds, and literally counting invasive Argentine ants.
One by one.
Counting them one by one. Up to 143,000 ants.
It is the absolute drudgery of ecological maintenance. And to be fair, that work is scientifically important. Argentine ants are a devastating invasive species that disrupt local ecosystems by outcompeting native insects and protecting agricultural pests.
Sure.
To measure the success of eradication efforts, you have to set up physical transects, essentially drawing imaginary grid lines across the island and meticulously count the population density within those grids.
But the wild part is, for a true field biologist, being out in the blistering sun counting ants while sweating inside a hazmat suit is still vastly preferable to sitting in an air-conditioned office.
Oh, absolutely.
Yet the entire academic and scientific system is designed to promote the best field workers out of the field. If you're incredibly good at being in the dirt, if you have that rare instinct for observing nature, your reward is that they move you to a desk.
Yeah, you get promoted to writing grant proposals, managing spreadsheets, and overseeing a team of younger, less experienced technicians.
Which is insane.
It creates a massive brain drain out in the actual field. The system inherently pushes its most instinctual, capable field workers into administrative roles. The people who are most equipped to observe, understand, and protect the physical environment are incentivized, both financially and professionally, to sit behind a computer screen.
It's so counterintuitive.
They end up writing highly technical, paywalled academic papers that, frankly, very few people outside of a small peer group will ever read.
Wait, I have to stop and look at this traditional scientific path because
Yeah.
it feels fundamentally broken. Is the standard academic pipeline actually stifling true innovation by demanding everyone follow this rigid publish or perish model? I mean, if your best observers are stuck writing grants, who's actually out there making the massive disruptive discoveries?
In many ways, yes, the system does institutionalize science to the point of stagnation. It creates a culture where the establishment becomes the old guard. They end up protecting their specific methodology, the way the grants are written, the way the transects are drawn, rather than relentlessly pursuing the most effective real-world conservation outcomes.
Right, because asking, why do we do it this way, becomes a threat to the funding structure.
Exactly. This is precisely why alternative forms of science communication, what you might call renegade science, have become so vital.
And the ultimate renegade move here, completely hacking the Hollywood entertainment machine to fund the science.
It's brilliant.
Imagine coming home exhausted, covered in pesticide, from counting those 143,000 ants, flipping on the TV, seeing the reality show Naked and Afraid, and having this epiphany. Surviving completely naked in a foreign jungle would actually be easier and more lucrative than doing entry-level biology work.
It is an incredible pivot. It is recognizing that the traditional vehicle for funding, begging for small university grants, is too slow, and identifying an alternative massive vehicle for exposure.
So he writes this incredibly arrogant, confident email to the producers. He gets cast, flies to the Panamanian jungle, and spends 21 days completely naked in the wild.
While the other contestants are struggling.
Oh, they're breaking down, crying over trying to start a fire. But he is treating it like a paid vacation. He's building stockpiles of jungle potatoes, easily navigating the environment, and treating the whole extreme survival scenario like a joke. And it works. The public response is massive.
He becomes a viral hit.
Yeah, but instead of taking the typical reality TV path he actually received an offer to host a goofy dating show with bears, which is hilarious. He relentlessly leverages that viral fame. He spends 3 years knocking on doors in Hollywood production companies until someone finally agrees to fund his own legitimate wildlife expedition show, Extinct or Alive.
The underlying dynamic here is the democratization of scientific attention. We live in an era where capturing mass public attention is a highly effective, albeit non-traditional, tool for real-world conservation.
For sure.
Now, there is a tremendous amount of pressure from the old guard of academia to look down on this. There is a snobbery that says, if you aren't doing a postdoc program, if you are making television shows or 60-second TikTok videos, you aren't a real scientist.
But if you post a video handling a venomous snake, explaining its ecology, and 10 million kids watch it and suddenly care about its conservation status, haven't you done infinitely more for the survival of that species than publishing a paper that sits behind an academic paywall where only 200 people will ever see it?
Absolutely. The traditionalists might feverishly deny it, but generating public passion, getting millions of eyeballs on a species, translates to real-world impact. It drives public donations, it influences policy, and it inspires the next generation of biologists. The vehicle is non-traditional, but the end goal, saving the planet's biodiversity, is achieved at a scale academia often struggles to match.
So, armed with this massive new funding from television and a huge public platform, this renegade approach is then pointed directly at the ultimate scientific taboo. We are talking about rethinking the very concept of extinction.
This is where the gut instinct methodology truly clashes head-on with the scientific establishment.
Because the way we declare an animal extinct is deeply, deeply flawed. The standard process often involves a few scientists conducting a relatively brief survey. They might spend 10 days in a specific area, setting up cameras in a neat little grid, returning to a comfortable base camp every night. And if they don't capture the animal on film or see it directly, they publish a paper declaring it eradicated from the planet.
Right. We have to understand the mechanics of the IUCN Red List, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. When they stamp a species as officially extinct, the consequences are catastrophic for that animal.
It's a death sentence.
Exactly. It is meant to be a scientific categorization, but in reality, all hope is lost. The government funding for protecting that habitat completely dries up. Anti-poaching patrols are disbanded. The conservation efforts are abandoned because, theoretically, there is nothing left to save. It becomes a tragic, self-fulfilling prophecy. If the animal wasn't entirely extinct before, the sudden total lack of protection ensures it soon will be.
So the mission becomes actively proving textbook science wrong. Proving that these animals are just lost, not gone. These are what they call Lazarus taxa species that rise from the dead. And finding them requires totally unorthodox methods.
Like the expedition to Zanzibar.
Yes, off the coast of East Africa. They were looking for the Zanzibar leopard, an apex predator that the scientific community hadn't officially recorded in decades. They didn't just walk around the forest with binoculars hoping to get lucky. They applied raw hunting logic.
The meat trees.
The meat trees, literally suspending large amounts of meat high in the branches to act as a giant, irresistible cat toy. And they heavily sprayed the area with synthetic pheromones to draw the animal out of hiding. And it worked. They caught it on a trail camera.
Let's break down the biology of why that works when passive observation fails. Big cats, like leopards, rely heavily on olfactory communication. They have a specialized organ in the roof of their mouth called the Jacobson's organ.
Okay, what does that do?
It allows them to essentially taste scents in the air. By using synthetic pheromones, which mimic the glandular secretions of a territorial rival or a female anestrus, you are not just hoping the animal walks by. You are chemically hacking their biological imperatives.
That's wild.
You are triggering an unavoidable, hardwired response that forces the animal to investigate the area to defend its territory or find a mate. It is active, manipulative biology rather than passive data collection.
But the absolute crown jewel of this renegade, instinct-driven approach happened in the Galapagos, specifically on the volcanic island of Fernandina. They were looking for the Fernandina Island tortoise.
This is a species where only one single individual had ever been collected in the entire history of science, and that was 114 years prior.
Exactly. The local scientific establishment literally laughed at the idea of an expedition. They said it was a total waste of time, money, and resources. But there were rumors, whispers of strange bite marks on a cactus seen by a park ranger decades ago. So they mount the expedition.
And the terrain on Fernandina is brutal.
It's covered in lava flows, which is this incredibly sharp, jagged, unstable volcanic rock that shreds your boots and reflects the equatorial sun back at you. The critical moment happens when the team is exhausted, and they have to decide where to focus their final search efforts.
What did the textbook say?
Well, the traditional advice, the established local scientific knowledge, said you must search the high elevations of the volcano because that is where the cloud cover provides moisture and green vegetation.
It is the logical textbook assumption. Herbivores need vegetation. Vegetation needs water. Water is at the top of the mountain. Therefore, search the top.
But instead of blindly following the textbook, he looked at the actual physical landscape. He trusted his gut instinct. He saw a small, isolated patch of trees down at a much lower elevation, surrounded by an ocean of jagged lava, and his brain just clicked. He said, let's check there.
Intuition over protocol.
They hiked down. Within days, the impossible happens. They find fresh scat. Looks just like iguana poop, but massively larger. Then they find a fresh bedding site scraped into the dirt under the shade. And minutes later, they find her, a female tortoise, hiding deep in a bush to escape the heat.
It is an incredible moment of vindication for biological intuition.
Think about the sheer magnitude of this moment. He drops to his knees in the volcanic dirt, and he's physically holding the single rarest animal on planet Earth. There's only one of her known to exist. But here is where the biology gets mind-blowing. She isn't just a relic waiting to die.
No, she's not.
She is an estimated 70 to 80-year-old female. And because tortoises do not go through menopause like mammals do, she is still biologically capable of reproducing. Even wilder, tortoises have a mechanism called spermal retention, meaning if she had mated with a male tortoise even 5 or 10 years ago, she could still lay viable fertilized eggs today.
The mechanics of spermal retention are staggering. Female tortoises have specialized storage structures called crypts in their reproductive tract.
Crypts?
Yeah, they can store viable sperm in these crypts, keeping it alive and nourished, and choose to fertilize their eggs years after mating if environmental conditions are poor.
That's insane.
What this means for conservation is massive. The window for saving a reptilian species is exponentially wider than we might assume with a mammal. Finding one female might actually mean finding the genetic material of an entire lost population.
Finding this specific tortoise on a massive volcanic island isn't just looking for a needle in a haystack. It is literally looking for a specific grain of sand on an entire beach. But instead of setting up a rigid mathematical grid and sifting the whole beach inch by inch, you are using your gut instinct to ask, where would that grain of sand actually want to be?
This explores the fundamental, ongoing clash between traditional scientific methodology and human biology. The textbook approach to a camera trap survey is to build a perfect mathematical square grid on a map. You place a camera exactly every 500 feet to cover the area statistically.
Right.
Science often feverishly denies the validity of gut instinct because it isn't easily quantifiable in a peer-reviewed paper. You can't write an equation for a feeling, but a human being is a biological creature.
All out there.
Precisely. When you are out in the wild, recognizing a faint game trail in the brush, seeing a specific type of flower and anticipating the insect that pollinates it, or looking at a scorching lava field and instinctively knowing an animal needs that one patch of shade, that is not magic. That is a deeply ingrained evolutionary skill. It is massive amounts of subconscious data processing. You don't put cameras in a rigid square, you put them where the animal is actually going to walk.
It's the difference between relying purely on the sterile data and relying on the data plus the human hard drive we've evolved over hundreds of thousands of years of surviving in the wild.
Exactly. And the stubborn refusal of the scientific establishment to acknowledge that human element, to demand a PhD before you can trust your own eyes, is actively holding us back from making these exact kinds of critical discoveries.
Which brings us to perhaps the most mind-bending, controversial part of this entire deep dive, because if we can rely on ancient primal human instinct to find lost species out in the wild mud, what happens when we swing the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme? What happens when we rely on the most cutting-edge, sterile biotechnology imaginable to resurrect species that are completely undeniably gone?
This is where science fiction steps out of the movie screen and becomes a highly funded, tangible reality.
We have to talk about Colossal biosciences. For anyone who hasn't seen the global headlines, this is a genetic engineering company working on what they call de-extinction. They are literally, right now, trying to bring back the woolly mammoth, the dodo bird, and the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger.
And the moment you say resurrect the woolly mammoth, it immediately triggers the Jurassic Park alarm bells for almost everyone. People picture giant monsters running amok.
Exactly. The public gets completely fixated on the image of a mammoth walking through the snow. But what is so deeply compelling here are the massive, totally unsung side benefits of developing this controversial technology. People miss what the tech is doing today for living animals.
The EEHV research.
Yes. Colossal is using the genetic sequencing technology they had to invent for the mammoth to solve a very real current crisis. EEHV. The elephant endotheliotropic herpes virus. That is a devastating hemorrhagic disease that currently kills about 20% of all young elephants globally.
That is a staggering mortality rate for a keystone species that reproduces as slowly as elephants do. Let's look at how the tech translates. To bring back a mammoth, Colossal has to sequence highly degraded ancient DNA found in permafrost.
Which is broken into a million pieces.
Right. They had to build entirely new software pipelines and next-generation sequencing tools just to read that broken genetic code. Once they built those advanced tools, they realized they could point that exact same technology at the EEHV virus.
Wow.
By rapidly sequencing the virus's genome, they are now developing mRNA vaccines, similar to how we tackled COVID-19 to protect living elephants. The quest for the mammoth is directly saving the modern elephant.
And it doesn't stop with elephants. There was massive news about Colossal successfully cloning a direwolf, an extinct Ice Age predator, which, again, is great for generating headlines. But the real quiet triumph is that they took that exact same somatic cell nuclear transfer technology, the cloning process, and used it to save the critically endangered North American red wolf.
A tangible conservation victory?
And they are aggressively working on the northern white rhino. Right now, there are exactly 2 northern white rhinos left on Earth, both living under armed guard in Kenya, and they are both females. The species is functionally extinct.
But with this cloning tech...
Yeah, if they have preserved skin cells or DNA from a deceased male, they can literally create a new male embryo, implanted in a surrogate southern white rhino, reintroduce genetic diversity, and save a species that humanity completely wiped out just to harvest its fingernails, which is biologically all a rhino horn is made of.
This introduces a massive paradigm shift in how we approach the fundamental economics of saving the planet. We are looking at the sudden rise of for-profit conservation.
It flips the entire script. For decades, there has been this romanticized yet deeply depressing idea that to be a true conservationist, you have to be a struggling martyr. You live in a moldy tent, you spend half your year begging universities for tiny grants, and you slowly, inevitably lose the battle against multi-billion-dollar logging and mining companies.
But suddenly, you have the billionaire tech mindset entering the chat.
There's a story of a field conservationist sitting down with the billionaire founder of Colossal, explaining the dire, heartbreaking situation with wild elephants. The billionaire listens and then simply asks, how much capital would you need to actually make a big dent in this problem right now?
And what did they say?
The expert, probably expecting to haggle over 50 grand, says $50 million. And the billionaire just casually says, okay, I'll go get 50 million.
To a traditional field biologist, that is an incomprehensible interaction. It completely breaks their understanding of how the world works.
It completely shorts out their brain, because they're used to fighting tooth and nail for a $5,000 grant just to buy new camera batteries and some trail mix.
But we have to ask, why shouldn't conservation be massively profitable? We readily accept that human doctors can save lives and build wealthy, profitable hospital systems. The for-profit model, backed by venture capital, might literally be the only mechanism large enough and fast enough to outpace the corporate interests that are currently destroying these habitats.
That makes a lot of sense.
It is the ultimate pragmatic approach, leveraging the extreme power of capitalism to fix the massive environmental problems that capitalism created.
But I have to ask the Jurassic Park question here. Let's look at the woolly mammoth or the dire wolf.
Yeah.
Even if Colossal has the genetic hardware, the perfect DNA code, the biological blueprints to physically build the animal's body, can they replicate the software?
Meaning the behavior.
Yeah, by software, I mean the deeply ingrained learned behaviors. How to migrate across the tundra, how to hunt in a pack, how to communicate warnings. Isn't there a massive, terrifying danger in dropping a genetically resurrected animal into a modern ecosystem that has evolved for thousands of years without it? It has no elders to teach it how to be a mammoth.
That is the ultimate ethical and biological tension of de-extinction. The hardware versus software concept in ethology, the study of animal behavior, is crucial here.
Right.
If you clone a currently living species like the red wolf, it can be integrated into an existing wild pack. It learns the software from its living peers. But an Ice Age mammoth, you are essentially rebooting a blank hard drive.
With no operating system.
Exactly. It has no matriarch to teach it the migratory routes. Furthermore, there is the issue of the microbiome, the gut bacteria necessary to digest specific foods, which is normally passed from mother to calf. The unintended ecological consequences of releasing a naive mega-herbivore could be severe.
So are we just playing God and risking further ecological collapse?
The argument from the de-extinction camp is that humanity has already played God. We just did it poorly. We aggressively accelerated the extinction of these species through overhunting and habitat destruction.
Okay, yeah.
Extinction is a natural biological mechanism, yes. Background extinction happens all the time. But human-caused hyper-accelerated mass extinction is not natural. The argument is that using this technology to mitigate our own damage, to aggressively right humanity's wrongs, justifies the technological risks. Provided, of course, that it happens in carefully controlled, monitored environments before any wide-scale wild release, it is about actively forcing a return to equilibrium.
The concept of forcing equilibrium leads us right into the dirt, the sweat, and the blood of the real world. Because while billionaires are engineering pristine DNA in sterile, climate-controlled labs, the reality of conservation on the ground is unimaginably messy. It often involves violent life-or-death clashes between massive animals and human survival.
The theoretical ethics of the lab meet the logistical nightmares of applied conservation.
Let's look at the sheer physical logistics of saving just one small group of animals. There was a massive operation in Mozambique, a $250,000 mission to physically translocate 24 wild elephants over 1,000 kilometers across the country.
That is a massive undertaking.
The amount of heavy infrastructure required is staggering. You need 3 helicopters, 6 semi-trucks, heavy-lifting cranes, custom-built conveyor belts to move the sleeping bodies.
And the margin for error is essentially zero. It is heavy machinery mixing with heavy biology.
Exactly. Listen to the mechanics of this process. The team has to dart a wild elephant from a helicopter hovering precariously just above the tree canopy. The pharmacology of the dart is intense. They use a drug called etorphine, often known as M99, which is an opioid thousands of times more powerful than morphine.
Wow.
Once that dart hits the massive muscle of the elephant, you have about 11 minutes before the animal falls asleep. But the moment that 5-ton animal hits the ground, a terrifying physiological timer starts.
Because of the pleural cavity.
Right. Elephants lack a pleural cavity. Their lungs are directly attached to their chest wall. This means they rely heavily on diaphragm movement to breathe, and they can only breathe through their trunks. If a 5-ton elephant falls awkwardly and its trunk gets pinned underneath its massive body weight, it cannot inflate its lungs. It will asphyxiate and die in exactly 3 minutes.
So the ground team has to wait for the elephant to fall because approaching a panicked, semi-drugged elephant on foot is an absolute death sentence.
Yes.
And then they have a frantic 3-minute window to land a helicopter in the bush, sprint through the thorns, physically pull that massive heavy trunk out from under the crushing weight of the body, and jam a stick in the end of it to keep the airway open.
And things go wrong. In one instance, a mother elephant is darted and goes down. The team rushes in to clear her trunk and monitor her vitals, but her baby is right there. And by the way, a baby elephant is still roughly the size and weight of a family car.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
The baby hasn't received a full dose of the tranquilizer. It is woozy, but it is panicked, full of adrenaline, and trying to aggressively defend its mother from these humans. They cannot shoot it with more drugs.
Because if the adrenaline suddenly drops while the second dose of etorphine hits, the massive blood pressure shift will instantly stop the young elephant's heart.
So what happens? The biologist literally hands off his tranquilizer rifle to a crew member, sprints full speed at this massive, thrashing baby elephant, jumps up, and double knee tackles it right in the side.
That is insane.
The sheer physical impact of a human flying into it tips the woozy elephant over. It hits the ground, the blood flow shifts naturally, and the elephant safely passes out.
It is an incredibly visceral, chaotic example of the sheer physical danger required to correct an environmental imbalance. But it begs the larger question, why did they have to spend $250,000 to move these elephants in the first place?
Because of the complex, often heartbreaking economics of human-wildlife conflict. The elephants had successfully overpopulated their small reserve and were naturally spilling out into the neighboring villages looking for food.
And we need to be clear about what these villages are.
Right. These aren't wealthy suburbs with fences. These are impoverished subsistence farmers growing small plots of corn just to survive the year. The elephants were coming in at night and trampling the crops. The farmers, desperate to protect their family's only food supply, were throwing fire at them and shooting at them with tiny .22 caliber rifles.
Which doesn't kill an elephant, it just infuriates it.
Exactly. The elephants became hyper-aggressive. And in one tragic instance, a bull elephant rampaged through a village, trampled a mud hut, and killed a pregnant mother and her toddler.
It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. When you look at global conservation, it is very easy to judge from a comfortable distance. We sit in cities and demand that nature be protected. But when a 5-ton elephant is actively destroying your only food supply, or a rhino horn offers a $100,000 payout to a family that literally cannot afford shoes or basic antibiotics for a sick child, the moral math changes drastically.
It's like global conservation is a massive game of Jenga. We keep pulling out the blocks, the sharks, the bees, the rainforests. We know the tower will eventually collapse. But how do we sit in our comfortable, air-conditioned lives and expect a subsistence farmer to care about the global Jenga tower when a 5-ton block is actively destroying their family's hut?
You can't. You fundamentally cannot ask a starving person to prioritize biodiversity over their child's life. And that is the crux of the global conservation failure. There is absolutely no blanket solution. You cannot apply a single ethical framework or a single economic policy to every ecosystem. Every single species and every conflict requires a unique, deeply nuanced approach that integrates the local human economy.
And sometimes that requires incredibly difficult, morally ambiguous, split-second decisions. There is a story from an expedition in Taiwan looking for the Formosan clouded leopard, one of the rarest cats on Earth, heavily driven to extinction by poaching.
What happened there?
They're deep in the remote forest and they encounter a local Taiwanese hunter. This guy is actively setting lethal wire snares in the exact habitat of the clouded leopard. It is a deeply tense standoff. The hunter is armed. But the biologist makes a split-second decision. He grabs the hunter's rifle, snaps it over his knee, breaking it in half, and physically forces the hunter out of the area.
That encapsulates the brutal reality of the front line. The ethical debate of cultural diplomacy and understanding local poverty goes out the window when you are staring at a snare that might kill the literal last breeding female of a species. It is the raw, physical enforcement of conservation.
Furthermore, we have to consider the emotional capacity of the animals involved in this crossfire. The profound emotional intelligence of elephants makes this human-wildlife conflict even darker.
The EQ, the emotional quotient of an elephant, is completely off the charts. They are highly sentient. They mourn their dead. They return to the bones of their ancestors and physically caress them with their trunks. They have complex social hierarchies and deep family bonds.
And crucially, they have generational memory. Studies suggest that the trauma inflicted by humans, the brutal poaching, the chaotic helicopter relocations, the conflict with farmers, is remembered.
The cortisol levels.
Yes. The stress elevates their cortisol levels, and that trauma is actively passed down through elephant herds for 6 to 8 generations. So even when we successfully dart them, load them onto a truck, and move them to a massive, perfectly safe national park, it will take centuries for that family group to trust the scent of a human again. We aren't just altering ecosystems, we are leaving deep emotional and psychological scars on the biosphere.
We are creating a traumatized natural world.
It is incredibly heavy. So if modern society, with all our advanced technology, our massive populations, and our sprawling agriculture, creates so much violent, traumatic conflict with nature, we have to look to the absolute deepest, most isolated parts of the world to see what true balance actually looks like, if it even exists anymore.
We are looking for a baseline, a model of coexistence that hasn't been completely corrupted by industrialization.
And that takes us on expeditions deep into the Amazon basin and the Congo rainforest. And things operate on a completely different logic there. The rules of Western science simply do not apply.
How so?
There is a story of an expedition navigating the Amazon River, led by an indigenous guide named Fausto. They are actively looking for a giant anaconda. One morning, Fausto calmly announces to the camera crew that they will definitely catch a massive snake that day. Why? Not because he read the barometric pressure or tracked a scent trail in the mud. He says it's because he had a prophetic dream the night before about a woman wearing a white dress.
To a classically trained Western scientist, that statement is completely absurd. It is unquantifiable folklore.
Right. But a few hours later, hacking through the dense jungle, they literally stumble upon a nearly 20-foot anaconda coiled inside an abandoned, rotting wooden hut.
Wow.
They have to wrestle this massive, prehistoric-feeling tube of pure muscle to the ground. Anacondas are aquatic ambush predators. They're incredibly powerful. It is a surreal moment where traditional spiritual intuition perfectly intersects with the physical, biological reality of the jungle.
It highlights that there are ways of knowing and interpreting the natural world that operate entirely outside of our rigid scientific method. The indigenous cosmology, interpreting a dream as a valid data point, might seem like magic to us, but it is the result of thousands of years of living so closely with an ecosystem that your subconscious processes environmental cues you aren't even aware of.
And navigating these ancient ecosystems is incredibly dangerous, not just because of a 20-foot snake, but because of the human element. Traveling through the deep Congo to find creatures that seem almost mythical, like the okapi, which looks like a bizarre hybrid between a zebra and a giraffe hiding in the dense rainforest, requires navigating incredibly complex geopolitics.
Right, the FARC rebels.
Yeah, look at the expeditions up remote rivers in Colombia that were controlled by FARC rebels. Just looking at the historical facts from the source, a local boat driver casually mentions to the crew that if they had visited just a year earlier, before a tenuous political truce had been signed, he would have personally cut their heads off and dumped them in the river.
That is terrifying.
And looking strictly at the reality of those regions, it underscores that these remote biomes operate completely outside the boundaries of normal law and order. You are in the true, unfiltered wild.
The lack of state control is exactly why those deep biomes remain relatively untouched by industrial logging. But within that wildness, in other parts of the world, there are incredible functioning models of human sustainability.
Yes. Let's talk about the Moai Island tribe in Vanuatu, an isolated island nation in the South Pacific. They are what you might call partially contacted. They have some modern items, maybe a few t-shirts, perhaps a small gas generator for a radio, but they still wear traditional grass skirts, they build their homes from the forest, and they hunt using traditional methods.
And their relationship with the environment is unique.
What is absolutely amazing is that they are described not just as survivors eking out a living, but as active forest gardeners and master ecosystem engineers.
They practice a form of indigenous permaculture. They actively manage their biosphere to avoid ecological collapse.
Exactly. They actively avoid the Easter Island syndrome, that historical trap where an isolated population consumes every available resource, cuts down the very last tree to build a monument, and their entire society starves and collapses.
Yeah.
The Moai Island tribe is hyper-aware of this delicate balance. Their daily habits reflect it. When they eat a wild mango, they don't just toss the pit into the ocean or a fire. They purposefully, methodically plant the seed back into the fertile dirt to ensure a tree grows for the next generation.
And their hunting practices.
When they hunt wild bats for food, specifically the large flying foxes that roost in the canopy, they don't just wipe out a colony. They specifically target only the bats without babies, leaving the breeding females alone to ensure the population constantly replenishes itself.
It is a profound level of environmental stewardship. Flying foxes are keystone pollinators for those islands. If you wipe them out, the fruit trees stop reproducing, and the humans starve. The tribe understands this intrinsic biological link. They only extract the interest from the ecosystem, they never touch the principle.
We constantly hear this narrative that human contact inherently ruins environments, that we are essentially a virus on the earth, multiplying and consuming until the host dies.
That's a common perspective.
But looking at the Mo Island tribe, I wonder, are modern humans structurally too far gone to ever act as forest gardeners again? Can we somehow relearn how to exist within a biome rather than just paving over it and building a massive concrete shopping mall on top of it?
That is perhaps the pivotal question of our time. The great danger we face right now is a completely homogeneous global society where every single environment, from a desert to a rainforest, is forced to conform to a sterile, concrete, standardized metric of human comfort.
Yeah.
These isolated or partially contacted tribes offer a living, breathing blueprint of sustainable coexistence. The concept of live and let live cannot just be a political slogan applied to differing human cultures. It must apply to the planet itself. We have to find a functional middle ground between purely homeopathic primitive living and the sterile, tech-obsessed, highly destructive modern society we have built. We have to reintegrate our biological selves with the living environment.
And that brings us to the end of an absolutely massive journey today. We've unpacked so much ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
We started in the raw, survival-driven heart of the Zimbabwean bush, learning how to walk silently past apex predators. We navigated the bizarre culture shock of an Oakland City park and hacked through the rigid, metric-obsessed bureaucracy of American academia.
We looked at the visceral reality of holding the rarest animal on Earth on a jagged lava field in the Galapagos.
We explored the billion-dollar biotech labs of Colossal, debating the ethics of using genetic cloning to resurrect the dead and cure the living. And we waded into the deep, mysterious jungles of the Congo and the Amazon to understand what true balance looks like. And if there's one overarching lesson from all these incredible expeditions, it's that truly understanding our world requires us to trust our human instincts.
Absolutely.
It requires us to bravely break outdated rules and, above all, to have immense actionable empathy for the creatures we share this planet with.
And this brings it directly back to you, the listener. Whether you are navigating the complex politics of a corporate boardroom, sitting in a rigid university classroom, or just managing the small patch of grass in your own backyard, rigid systems and square grid thinking will often fail you.
They blind you to the reality on the ground.
Exactly. You have to trust your instincts. Look for the unorthodox path when the standard pipeline doesn't fit. And remember, fundamentally, beneath the clothes and the technology, that you are a biological creature interacting with a vastly complex, living world. You are not separate from nature. You are a part of it.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to chew on long after you take off your headphones and step back into your daily routine. We're entering an era where artificial intelligence, CRISPR, and genetic engineering are allowing us to completely decode, manipulate, and even resurrect nature from scratch.
We are building the tools of gods.
But as we build these tools, what if the ultimate key to our survival isn't inventing the next piece of technology, but rather remembering the deep primal biological instincts that we've spent the last 1,000 years trying so desperately to suppress? When you look out at the diagnostic muddy waters of our future, maybe the answer isn't a better X-ray machine. Maybe the answer is finally learning how to swim in the mud.